Got a great panel. We're going to discuss not-for-profits and civil society organisations, and I sometimes feel like saying when we're talking to finance ministers, I often say that in Australia, our growth is better than anything they've achieved, because in our sector, for over a decade, we've been growing at over 5%, and in our country, we employ almost 10% of the workforce, and we have 5 million volunteers, which means around 1 in 10 people either work in a not-for-profit or 1 in 3 volunteer in a not-for-profit. So if we're going to talk about economic activity in our country, and you're going to talk about jobs, you have to talk about our sector as a major contributor. We're turning over 100 billion, and we're contributing 5% of the GDP. And sometimes I think we need to make the economic arguments about our contribution much stronger. So with that very brief intro, because I know we're short of time, I want to introduce the panel. And I thought I'd start by asking each of the panel what they see as a strong civil society organisation, and how they would know whether or not it was one. And I'm really following on from what Sergio Zani said when he said, not all not-for-profits are good, and some in themselves are almost profiteering. And so the question I want to put to all of the panel, and we'll go to them individually, is really how do you build a good civil society, civil organisation representing particular communities, and what are the hallmarks of that? And I'm going to start with John Hyde. John is a former Western Australian Member of Parliament who's now head of the Global Organisation of Parliamentarians Against Corruption. And he tells me he's based in Thailand and does a lot of work for the UN. And so I'll go to you first, John.
Okay. Look, thanks very much. I think what we often lose sight of is using existing structures really well. And part of our role in being an organisation trying to get better parliamentary oversight is to not only make parliamentarians aware of the huge powers they have over their own governments and the tools of Parliament, the tools of vetting, resourcing. We see it, I guess, in Australia all the time in terms of Senate estimates or committee work, but other parliamentary venues and opportunities are there as well. And so a strong civil society group, an effective civil society group, is using individual parliamentarians in that oversight role. In terms of really engaging with the media these days, Parliament is a very cheap and transparent way to actually get more oversight. I was originally a journalist in the West in the 80s. Newsroom we had then was 3 floors. You go into a newspaper office today or even a radio station news office and there may be 1 or 2 people in there. So if you can be using Parliament, be using individual parliamentarians as other avenues for us to get up our civil society strategies and our requests, it's a much more effective use of time and the medium.
Thanks, John. Steve Price is Deputy Advocacy and Campaigns Director at Oxfam International. He's based in Vietnam and he supports Oxfam staff and partners across the Global South in their work and manages Oxfam's Global Confederation Development Team. Steve, what's a good civil society organisation and how do we get there?
Thanks. From my perspective, a good civil society organisation is one which both stands up for what we believe, that has clear values and clear purpose, and also practices what we preach. So we absolutely have to adhere to the same standards that we are calling for governments and others to adhere to around transparency, around accountability, around participation, and so on. And also, I think we need to take our part in broader society in terms of shaping the type of society that we want to see. And included within that is making sure that the norms of society value the contribution that a diverse range of civil society organisations can bring. And I think that's particularly pertinent now because for those of you who were at last year's C20, you'll remember that there was a very spirited discussion around the Russian Foreign Agents Law that actually led to the Russian Deputy Prime Minister, who was on stage committing to reviewing the implementation of that law. More recently in India, we've seen some constraints on funding from foreign sources, which is making life challenging for some Indian NGOs. Just last week, we saw the Indian Bureau of Intelligence leak a report suggesting that civil society organisations that stand up for free, prior and informed consent for big infrastructure projects, that are working to look at the impacts of dams and things, are actually anti-development and anti-Indian. I would suggest that's wrong, clearly, and we collectively have a role to play in ensuring that there is adequate civil society space.
Okay, thanks, Steve. I'll come back to those issues in a sec, but we'll just finish going through the panel for the first time. And Professor Helen Sullivan is Director of the Melbourne School of Government. Her research and teaching focuses on changing state-society relations and modes of interaction. She's published widely. Her latest book is Hybrid Governance in European Cities, Neighbourhood, Migration and Democracy. So I gave you a plug, Helen. You should all go out and buy the book. I haven't read it, but I'm sure it's great. I will. So, Helen, what makes a good civil society organisation? How do we get there?
Okay, thanks. Well, most of my work is at the local level. Most of my work explores interactions between states and state institutions of various descriptions and society variously described. So I'm interested in what happens both when civil society tries to engage with the state, but also when the state determines it wants to engage with civil society. And I think, from my point of view, based on the work that I've done, I think that, to say something a little bit different from what's already been said, it seems to me that a strong civil society institution or organisation needs a very clear sense of purpose, and also needs to be very clearly and confidently independent of the state. And I think one of the things we've certainly seen in the north, or in the west, depending on how you want to talk about it, is through the language of collaboration and partnership, this sort of intermingling of state and society, with civil society organisations very often becoming the deliverer of services. Now, there isn't necessarily anything wrong with that, but I think one of the consequences of that is that there's become... You can't hear me?
No, I'm just going to check.
Okay, well, I won't say all that again. But you should read my book. For me, the key thing is civil society organisations both having a strong sense of values and beliefs and clear purpose, but also being confident, as I say, and capable of being independent of the state. The opportunities now, particularly for local organisations to be interconnected, not just nationally but internationally, I think allow for a much greater capability of independence through those interconnections. So there are ways around the kind of clientelism that we've seen in all sorts of different ways in all sorts of different states. So I think that's a key issue. I think the other thing that hasn't been mentioned, and I consider very strongly to be an important part of a powerful, confident civil society organisation, is that it presents a safe space. A safe space which does not just take on the language and the symbols and the messages of governments and other organisations, but generates its own and can use those language and symbols as ways of then choosing how and when it wishes to engage. So those things, for me, are key, I think.
Thanks, Helen. And I'll now go to Adorito Suarez, who's the former Anti-Corruption Commissioner in Timor-Leste. Adorito's worked for various national and international NGOs as a consultant. He's previously been elected as a member of the Constituent Assembly, which drafted Timor-Leste's first constitution, and was the first commissioner of the Anti-Corruption Commission. And he's now completing his PhD at the ANU. Adorito, tell us, what's a good civil society organisation, and how do we know it is one?
Thank you, and thanks for the organizing. I think that's very privileged for the second time for me to appear before the audience. I will agree with the rest of the panel, of course. I think someone highlighted about the importance of using the legal avenues that have for us to do advocacy. I will bring different aspects of the role of civil society, especially taking into account about the post-conflict society. I think one of the most important things is really public awareness about the social issues, social justice that we are facing. I think that's one of the really urgent agenda for civil society, given the weak system that we are facing, for instance, the legal mechanism, or about we are talking about the deficit of democracy that, I think the last, since yesterday, we've been talking about this. So I think one of the important aspect that civil society can really do is really about the public awareness. On my experience, for instance, about raising the public awareness about the impact and causes of corruption. And I think the other issues that I think Professor Helen was just raised about the independent of civil society from the state or business. I think we are facing another challenge, for instance, in developing countries where NGOs or civil society in general start getting funds from the state, from the government. That's also bring another issue of the question of independence. But I think definitely we need to look on the issue of independence in much broader context. And I think I was raising this yesterday about how to engage what I call as the principal engagement, where we engage with business or state, but without really losing our independence.
Well, perhaps if sorry, is this on? Yeah. Perhaps if we go to that issue, and I'll ask anyone else to comment, because we've talked briefly, each of you has raised the issue of the relationship between civil society organisations and government. What characterises a good relationship? And again, how do we know that we're there? Does anyone want to comment on that?
Sure.
Sure.
Yeah, so I believe it's about we need to strive for a relationship of mutual respect and a relationship which allows government to do its job, but also, and part of that job is to provide an enabling framework for civil society, but also that allows civil society in a non-party political way to play its role as an advocate, as a convener, that also enables it to ensure both to speak up for people and even better to provide a platform for people who are excluded to be able to raise their own voices in a way which, as I say, is not party political but can constructively challenge to make society better.
Helen, I know you've done some work in this area. How do you see the relationship working, and when is it not working?
Oh, well, there are a myriad of examples of when it's not working. One of the things that we did when we did a longitudinal study of trying to think about these relationships and looking at a range of empirical examples, we came up with a typology. It's what you do when you're an academic. And we identified those institutions that had the kinds of characteristics that Steve was talking about. We characterised as institutions of sites and challenge. So they were places where government and civil society could come together in the way that Steve talked about. But there were also two other very important expressions. One was simply where the relationship was one where civil society was determinedly separate and saw itself as a safe space, a source of support to enable some of the things that Steve's been talking about. So the role there of civil society organisations was not that they saw themselves as doing the engaging, but they created the opportunities for people to build their capacity, their confidence, and to create the bridges into those kinds of relationships. And then the third one, which we saw an awful lot of, was what we ended up calling institutional prisons. And these were relationships where it seemed that despite the best efforts on both sides, I mean, governments are not necessarily malign in their intentions here, but very often because they don't understand power, they don't understand the ways in which their exercise of power can be so all-encompassing, the way in which they use language, the way in which they set up meetings, all of these things that are very familiar to us. You create an institution that is entirely dysfunctional, where people end up shouting, where people end up not coming, where people end up in conflict that is unhealthy and unproductive. So it seems to me that Steve's given us some very good indicators of what a healthy relationship is, but I think it's also important to allow for a range of relationships because not all civil society organisations, as we know, are engaged in the same activities, and not all will always want to be having that kind of relationship with the state or indeed with business.
Perhaps before we go to the audience, I'll just ask one more question I think arises from your opening answers, and that is you talked about the importance of civil society organisations being focused on their purpose and implementing their purpose within a set of values. How do you measure that or report on that? And is that being done? I mean, when we look around at civil society organisations, are they measuring their purpose and whether they're achieving it? And if not, should they be, or how could they be? And how do we know that they're achieving that purpose within a set of values? And many civil society organisations are very good at setting purposes and outlining their values, but what does that translate to? And I might start with John, and then we'll go across everybody, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Yeah, I think there's two things at play here. We've got to be really careful of the ticker box of civil society engagement, and it's concerning me a lot with the sustainable development engagement at the moment, and it's happening in the UN in New York. Civil society's there, excluded from some sessions, but the box is being ticked that civil society is engaged. Now, last weekend I was in Tonga, and for the first time the members of parliament there sitting at the same table with their civil society groups, women, transgender, youth, for the first time, and genuine engagement on proposed legislation, but also resourcing. So I think we've got to be really careful about the quality of the engagement that we're looking at, and perhaps not be used as tools for UN, World Bank, or even our own governments to be ticking the box for civil society engagement.
Steve?
I think we absolutely do need to be able to clearly demonstrate our value and our impact. I think the way that different organisations do that varies according to what it is they do. Even for Oxfam, our work spans delivering water and sanitation services in crises. And right now I have colleagues in Syria, in Lebanon, in Jordan doing just that. And they measure their success in terms of how many hundreds of thousands of people receive water and sanitation. I work in the advocacy field. I and my colleagues measure our success in terms of policy changes that we bring about that have a clear impact or potential impact on the lives of people in poverty. And colleagues who work on development measure their impact, say, in increased livelihoods for people in poverty and so on. And for any organisation that will vary. But I think we absolutely do need to clearly put in place systems of measuring and demonstrating impact, but also recognising and agreeing completely that we shouldn't fall into the short-term tick box mentality. I used to be Oxfam's country director in Vietnam, and there we worked for over 10 years on a programme to change and improve the primary school education system. And it was only after just over 10 years that the government, who'd been watching and looking and learning all the way through, said, actually, we are going to replicate this model nationwide. Now, both internally, and that had been externally funded at one point, after every couple of years, people said it's not working, you've got to stop it. So we need to make sure that we have long enough timeframes to recognise that the types of societal change which we're all trying to bring about often are long term and are much longer than those relatively short funding windows.
I wish we would all stop talking about measuring things. I think this is a conversation about accountability. I observed the discussion that was happening earlier about the communique. And for me, that's a really good indication of the quality of what's being done, the level of engagement and the potential, not necessarily to say the outcome, but the potential for something to have some impact. So I worry not just about the tick box end of this, but I worry that all of our discussions, which are really about accountability and impact, have become turned into this lexicon of performance management. And I think if we started talking more about accountability and the different ways in which we could achieve that, and that takes into account some of the things that you've been saying, we'd be far more effective at making our case. The more I think we play into the games of the performance framework, whatever the latest one happens to be, the less likely I think we'll be able to be to talk about the texture and the depth and the real impact of the work that civil society organisations do.
Yes, I will agree on the issue of accountability. I think, especially in developing countries, of course, you have all the donors funding. You're accountable to your donors funding, your donors, but how the accountability to the beneficiaries, and I think that's one of the crucial issues that facing many of the civil society groups in many of developing countries. Of course, in terms of international international level, I think I will share panel's thought, what I call as the center that I'm joining at the ANU. We are developing the concept of ritualism. Let's say every year you have your report on every international covenant at the UN level. You write your shadow report maybe from the NGOs, but how many of us ever read the shadow report? And if we talk about accountability, that's really a document that we can base on and question whether we have report recommendation from any committee at the UN level, how it is follow up in the local context. And I think that's really a big gap on what prescribed international treaties on what's going on the ground.
Helen, would you endorse what Adarito said, that accountability needs to be to the community from which the organisation comes, or are there other accountabilities that need to be considered equally?
Well, there are all sorts of accountabilities. I think where we are is that the accountability upwards to the people who give you the funding has really overtaken the accountability to the communities. Whether those are the communities that fostered the establishment of the organisation in the first place, or whether they're simply the communities that have now become members, however you'd want to talk about that, of those organisations. So you snuck the word in equally at the end, which I think was a bit devious. I think there's a range of accountabilities, and I think that what Adarito's talking about is absolutely where we ought to be focusing. And that's really what I was trying to get at, that if you think about this in terms of accountability, then that requires our organisations to think as much about their membership, however they consider that, and as much about how they interact with and communicate with that membership as they do with whoever may be giving them money to deliver a particular project for a particular period of time.
Okay. I'm going to open it up for questions, but what we're going to try and do is take 2 or 3 questions and then come back to the panel rather than have just the sort of question and answer straight. So has anyone got any questions? I can happily keep asking questions, but yes, the man in the yellow shirt. Are we just waiting for a mic? It's coming.
Thank you. I like what Helen said about the need for civil society organizations to be independent of the state. And my concern is about what the minister spoke a little earlier, where he was actually trying to posit civil society against the welfare state.
Yeah.
and this is the first time that I've ever heard it, and I feel it's an extremely dangerous ploy that he's trying to lead us to believe that we are not working towards a civil welfare state, and that the civil society can be independent of a vision of a welfare state. It's also a ploy of those who believe in a minimal state, and those who believe that civil society organizations should play the role of the state where the states cannot reach, and that's again a dangerous ploy. It almost feels that the civil society is being built conceptually as an institutionalized vent against public anger, right? And so what are your thoughts about it? I mean, I don't want it to be reiterated more and more, what the minister said, and I hope it doesn't become a norm,
Okay.
And the second point that I wanted to make was civil society organizations and mass organizations. There is a wide divide between the two. And all across the world, mass organizations do not believe in civil society organizations. Some of them might partner for strategic reasons once in a while. We are to benefit more than they by coming together. So are there views about how we can probably synergize our efforts, and if there can be political alignment in between mass organizations and civil society organizations?
Okay. Other questions? There's one up the back in the middle, just in front of the cameras.
Thank you. That last comment raises a question which has rather determinedly been avoided, which is, what is civil society? Who is civil society? And there were a few comments about politics being somehow separate from civil society, whereas in my view, politics, as distinct from government, is very much what civil society is here about. And the relationship between political expressions of viewpoints and, quote, civil society organisations, whatever they may be, is I think a really important question, which is partly exemplified by what we've the presenters at this 2 days, where we've had a couple from the government, one from the opposition, and none from any other political entity. So I think that whole question of the relationship, what is civil society, how does it relate to politics and to political groups, mass organisations, is crucial.
Okay, I'll take one more question if there is one, then we'll have a discussion. Okay, we might go straight to who wants to comment on either of those? Steve?
Okay. I completely agree that what we are all doing together is political with a small p, and it's important that we do engage in the debates that affect real people in the countries in which we live and in countries in which we work, and that is an inherently political process, and I think that's right, and we need to engage absolutely robustly in those processes. What I think you picked up on in my opening remark is I think that we want to avoid becoming, as NGOs, identified with one particular political party in most contexts. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to that. So, for example, under the German electoral system, they fund each political party has its own civil society organisation, like the Heinrich Böll Foundation from the Green Party, like the Friedrich Ebert, I think, Stiftung, apologise for my pronunciation, and so on, from different parties. And they actually get money under the electoral system in proportion to the number of votes that they got at the last election. And then they go and work in other countries. It's quite an interesting system. But I think certainly in the countries in which I've worked, the space will quite soon get shut down for more conventional CSOs if they're seen as being tied to any one particular political party. And our job is to stand up for our values, for our constituents on the issues, and stand up for what we believe, regardless of which particular political party may or may not align with those views at that particular time.
Yeah, look, I think there's a couple of really good issues going on here, and I think a number of us in the audience, when the Minister had that phrasing over the welfare state this morning, and we're seeing it time and time again by, I think particularly in conservative fields, the refashioning of language. And if we're looking at what is the role of civil society, and it's certainly to be true to the core values, to make sure that those core values are being pushed, but also we've got to be realistic. The G20 is an economic ministers forum. 2% growth, whatever they're talking about in terms of growth, is their bottom line. We're not going to be making headway by saying a lot of our human rights-based core issues are non-negotiable. So while we're in this forum, I think of C20, G20, it's got to be a lot different to perhaps some of the UN fora, where we've got the ability to engage with country delegations and to get real civil society involvement in those country delegations. As somebody from the human rights background, if we're looking at gender, about women's rights to abortion, to the timing and the spacing of children, our language now is moving towards we're against unsafe abortion, because that then locks the Conservatives out of the opposition area and into supporting a number of gender issues. And it's about talking about the economic benefits of having informed choices on contraception. And these are light years away from our human rights-based intrinsic core values that we believe in. But if we actually want to get progress as a civil society group on those core issues, we've actually got to be using the language of the neoconservatives and the language of government.
Do we need to do that, Helen?
I wouldn't say so. And this was my starting point, really. I think part of the trouble that civil society organisations, many of them certainly in the West, have got into is precisely because they've tried to play that game, and they're never as good at it. And part of the reason I think they're not as good at it is precisely because it's very, very difficult to separate out, and I find it almost impossible to separate out an argument about economic growth that doesn't have as a necessary corollary some understanding of human rights and social justice. So I understand the desire sometimes to find a way of tactically engaging, but I think if you do that for too long, you find yourself, and we have lots of evidence of this, of being taken into a space where your other issues then are not regarded. And that's why, for me, it's so important that civil society organisations have their own language, have their own symbols, try to talk about these issues in the way in which they want them to be talked about, recognising that that's uncomfortable for economic ministers and treasury ministers and people who want to talk about public-private partnerships and infrastructure. Those are important things, but there are other ways of talking about them.
Isn't one of the things that's happening, and I'm probably becoming an old man, but if I watch television now and I see advertisements from major companies, I'm often sitting there wondering what this advertisement is about. You know, there's a whole range of images, people hugging each other, people being really nice to each other, families coming together, kids realising their potential, becoming piano players or football players or whatever else. And then at the end, it's an ad for a bank or an insurance company or something else. And what they're doing is saying the values are what get people engaged in a product. So they're laying out a set of values. With McDonald's, it's all about family happiness and togetherness, and happy meals are happy times, and the research shows that. So my question is, aren't for-profit businesses better in some ways at having language around values and positioning their products as values than civil society organisations? And I'll go to you first, mainly because you've already talked about business partnerships with civil society organisations being part of what we have to begin doing.
Well, I guess one of the broader jargon that I don't see much raised these last 2 days is about corporate social responsibility, and I think that's one of the issues that have been raised in many places, and I think once you talk about that, and also you have to, again a strong reference to human rights. I think I'd like to touch a bit also on the issue of civil society versus mass organization. We are facing a challenge how to communicate in a progressive, in a productive way with the government, with the power holders. I think in the movement itself, we are also facing a very difficult task to communicate between ourselves. And I think word is too much cynicism for me. I think we have to find a way how to mediate this dialogue between the importance of the role of NGOs as well as the role of mass organization, and I think that's really a huge gap how to communicate and in order to bring a fight for social justice. And I think from my observation, I think just too many cynicism among this kind of movement. We kind of separated in our own boxes. I think we have to really think outside the boxes how to communicate and have much productive dialogue in order to bring better social change. Sorry, I don't think I touched on your first issue.
No, you did. That was good.
But
yeah, go.
I want to pick up directly on this issue about banks making you feel warm and fuzzy, because of course what they do is they're trying to get you to consume something. They're trying to get you to buy something. And I immediately, when you were talking, went to Oxfam and thought, no, they've had a really good campaign, some really good campaigns, which are about other sorts of values. But they too, of course, are about buying goats or, buying a bit of a goat or whatever it is that you... So I think there is something about the way in which so much of how we consider ourselves to be satisfied is now bound up with ideas of consumption, and that clearly is problematic. But of course, that's not the only way of doing it. And there are alternatives. And there are other ways of talking about values and of communicating values that don't rely on consumption. I just think it's hard because we're so much surrounded all the time by messages which are predicated on consumption. I mean, a challenge for the School of Government at the moment is how do you engage Australians, not the fantastic people in civil society organisations, but the people who read the mainstream press, which in Australia tends to be owned by a particular company. How do you persuade people that there's something important, fundamentally important going on in this country this year with the G20, that they should be interested in, engaged in and participating in? And that's a big challenge for us. This is an opportunity that's not going to come to Australia for an awfully long time again, if ever. And it's remarkable how hard it is outside of the expected quarters, how little discussion there is of the kinds of issues that you've been talking about. Now, whether we try to do that by creating warm and fuzzy adverts or whether we try to do that in some other way, I don't know, but we certainly need to do something.
Well, I suppose there's also, I'm going to throw to you in a sec, Steve, but there's also a question of do we do that best, or are there other people who do it best? I mean, the Nike campaign in the US at the moment around children living 5 years younger than their parents, because the projected life expectancy of kids born now, because of the preventative health approaches and diet and exercise, they're going to die 5 years younger than their parents. And they run this campaign where they have about 20 different kids all asked, and they're all about 6, 8, 10, and they're all asked, what would you do if you had 5 years more? And it's a beautiful ad because they say all kinds of silly and wonderful things. And at the end they say, we're leaving out a legacy for our children of a shorter lifespan. We need to do something about it. And then you think, but this is made by a company that sells exercise products. Is it wrong that they link that kind of use of their product to achieving a social benefit or raising those kinds of social issues? And are they just better at it than we are? Steve?
I think we're seeing more than just the appropriation of values-based language by private sector actors, we've seen in many countries a capture of the political process by elites, many of whom are senior private sector actors in their own right, and a change of terms in the debate. And clearly that is not a good thing. I disagree with what John said earlier. I believe that whilst we do clearly have to use language that different audiences understand, we absolutely have to stand up for the fundamental values that we believe in all the time. And if we're blowing in the wind, there's no point in having us as organisations. ACFID, the umbrella body here in Australia for development NGOs, on Thursday evening held a process inviting people from many countries to look at the challenges facing civil society now across the world, and they included defunding of advocacy organisations, especially those representing marginalised groups, reducing formal mechanisms to input into policy processes, restrictive legislation to restrict campaigning, especially against the private sector, and increasingly the civil society space being taken by the private sector. So while clearly the private sector and the enlightened private sector has a very positive role to play, it's vital that we also defend our space. And when we see them doing good things, encourage them to do good things, but when we see them doing things which lead to the massively growing inequality in the world, which we've been talking about today, which lead to, in the US, almost all of the growth since 2008 being captured by the top 1%, the list goes on. When we see that, we have to stand up and challenge it. And we also have to, when we see the adverts, whether it's for Nike or McDonald's or whatever, you have to interrogate that and think, hey, actually, do I believe this? Or am I trying to be hoodwinked into a particular system? And it's our responsibility to challenge some of the assumptions which we are being daily drip-fed and say, actually, we believe in a different world, and we can demonstrate some practical ways of bringing that about.
John, I'm going to give you a kind of right or reply, but I also want to say, if I'm a finance minister, and we've already heard our foreign minister talk about the need to promote business as a form of foreign aid, and we've seen our social services minister talk about government pulling back, and we're seeing social service contracts in this country go to for-profit businesses. I'm really wondering, if I'm a finance minister sitting at a G20, why would I listen to civil society when what I've seen as their economic role is increasingly being diversified across for-profit organisations and others?
Yeah, look, I guess the point I'm trying to make is that to be aware of the audience, and that the key issue in the world today is inequality. But if we're talking to finance ministers or the G20, I think it's got to be that in order to achieve real growth, you've got to get rid of inequality. So as it is the most marginalised who are having meaningful jobs and able to participate in their own local economies, that's the growth that's going to not only get rid of or lessen inequality, but it's actually going to have more impact in terms of overall growth and beneficial long-term growth. So to me, maybe it's a nuancing of language, and that civil society, NGOs, can chew gum and walk at the same time. Yes, we've got to be true to our values. We've got to be human rights based, but we've also got to be able to engage with Kevin Andrews or others who may come, ministers who come and believe, well, let's agree to disagree, rather than Kevin Andrews having left this morning and having had an incredible awakening and been convinced by what we've been on about yesterday and today. Now, we can be the greatest complainers, whiners, whingers, but if we're not able to make decision makers change their way of thinking or see the real benefits to the marginalised and to the real world's community by adopting our inequality abetting measures, then we're failing, and we've got to be more accountable ourselves.
Okay, we've got time for a few more comments or questions. So I've got three, and we'll start, I'll go right to left, just so I'm not accused of bias. We'll start over there. Your microphone's right next to you.
How wonderful. I get to say something. I'm very excited about the fact that a point has been made right now about the language that is necessary in order to persuade and influence a certain agenda by a global body like the G20. I couldn't agree with more with your comment in particular about the fact that, for example, if you wanted to put gender on the agenda, how are you going to do so? I think I've spent 24 hours, 48 hours, whatever time we've been here, saying how important it is to put gender on that agenda, because there is a very compulsive and clear argument on the benefit of having more women participating in the workforce. It's an economic imperative. Madame Lagarde has mentioned it during the ministers' meeting. The only thing I'm concerned with right now, and I don't know how to address this, is where exactly are we in the C20 agenda items, which under that 4 category is going to, this important issue of gender is going to be included. And I think also, having had some experience in international forums and multilateral activities as head of trade, I felt really compelled to say that we need to understand that the G20 is not today, but G20 has happened before. And there is a declaration in Los Cabos, Mexico, which specifically addresses the issue of gender. But I haven't seen anything very clearly from this committee or this forum or the summit that actually addresses the fact that we're not talking to each other. We're talking to heads of states, and we're talking policy, and we're not talking about, human rights per se, but rather how we can change certain issues. And I think making the G20 in some ways accountable for a declaration that was made 2 years ago would probably be, in my view, a sensible way of addressing the gender issue and putting forward a few items. That's all I have to say.
Thanks for that. That's a very useful contribution, and there's a microphone coming down to your right.
Thank you. Brinny Goodwill from Jubilee, Australia. I think it's really critical that we appreciate that civil society is here in part because of bad design. If policies, procedures, government, from political, economic, social and cultural were well designed, we would all be out of a job, probably pretty potentially. And I think that there's a very critical role for us to continue to hold forth what better design is. So I take in point, of course, we have to negotiate with governments and discuss and negotiate issues about how to create a transition to where we need to be going. But if we're not holding out some of the vision of what good design is and how we achieve more accountability of our companies. I mean, Jubilee Australia would not be here if loans were not placed very carelessly in the 80s and onward. And yet still we do not have controls that stop financial institutions or even multilateral development banks engaging in those loans. Same things around corporate accountability. Despite the Nike ads, etc., we still have, as Steve's pointing out, some of the investment decisions that impinge terribly on local communities. So I think we need to be very conscious of design and good design, which creates the kind of society that we're talking about, and how to do ourselves all out of a job, really, as we are negotiating with the day-to-day. In some traditions, governments come and go, and I think we have to, and there's the longevity. And if we forget that coming and going and the longevity, we will have missed a real opportunity to hold the place for how we can create a much more sustainable and accountable community.
Thank you very much. We've got one more comment and then one from Cassandra, and then I might throw to the panel to close. Is that right, Amanda?
Chris Williams. I liked Helen Sullivan's language intensely and very well done. I also liked the way the panel made John Hyde accountable I have a struggle with the neoliberal language. There is only one narrative underway in Australia at the moment. Joe Hockey pulled a rabbit out of the hat in February and he said 2% over 5 years, not our problem, but 2%, we are going to deliver it, and it's the only narrative underway in Australia at the moment. This summit has got very, very close to saying no growth without inclusion. Don't go patting yourselves on the backs for a jobless recovery. But we're not telling that story. So when we leave today, the only narrative in Australia is Joe Hockey's narrative, and it is the neoliberal narrative, and we are not prepared to challenge that. So while we're talking about one side of the ledger, which is inclusion or jobs, we've forgotten about the other side of the ledger, the 2%. And I categorically have gone, stuck my neck out in the Economist magazine by saying there will be no economic growth across the G20 without inclusion. And I would challenge John Hyde's language, and I'd like the panel perhaps to respond as to whether we as a summit can challenge the neoliberal language. Thank you.
Okay. Cassandra, can we bring a mic down to Cassandra, just down at the front?
Conscious of time, I'll start to speak. There's this tension that I think we're very importantly grappling with, which is one of the most important difficult conversations we have to have, is I think about our role and responsibility in deeply challenging power, and also having the sharpened skills of persuasion. This idea that can you be both inside the tent and outside the tent? Do we need to split ourselves up and be different things in order to grapple both with our responsibility to unsettle in a very, very significant way the power dynamic in society? And I think that is ultimately our most important strategic question. I am deeply convinced that we have a lot to learn about the human capability of both being very determined to say that is enough, and also stay with being face-to-face. Now, whether you want to use the paradigm of war and peace, there is a time for the war, and that is very tactical about recognising the deep strength that we have about our relationships, not face-to-face with government, but in all the other parts of community, and that we tend, I think, to have spent less in the very technical questions about how we do that well, to build our strength in, if you want to use the term war, the war of the shifting of power, so that we can be very persuasive in the face-to-face engagement that we must continue to have. And I must say, John, to having spent a lot of time on the economic debates, and we absolutely can win them. The evidence is there, we can win that. But I think the language of love and of society and of the deep humanity that we are here to defend is also, we must get in the room, but we must use that language as well on the road ahead. That's my thought. Thanks.
Okay. I'm going to, thanks, Cassandra. I'll give you a hug later. We're going to ask the panel to just have each have one final comment, and then we'll hand it back to Amanda. John?
Look, I'd endorse the comments on gender. I'm here with my Global Organisation of Parliamentarians Against Corruption hat on, and the C20 engaged really strongly on anti-corruption transparency. I think early on we tried to get a lot of gender involved, but it's so broad that gender wasn't there. I'm so emboldened in a place like Timor-Leste, which now leads the Asia-Pacific, 38% female parliamentarians. There's a direct correlation in research between having more female parliamentarians and more female decision makers and more transparency, less corruption. Most of the Pacific is still at 3%, but there's an awareness in the Pacific now that if you dinkum about gender, about getting real empowerment and real sharing of power and ending inequality, you've got to have more women empowered.
Steve?
Thanks. Yeah, just two things. Firstly, from my perspective, inequality is the defining challenge of our time. Everyone from the Pope to President Obama to the World Economic Forum to the Managing Director of the IMF agree that. They agree it for different reasons. Some because they clearly, as I do, understand it as a moral issue. Others because they understand that economic growth, however much we have of it, will fail to meet its objective of lifting people out of poverty unless we reduce inequality. So I believe that it is essential that we change the narrative from being just about growth to being about overcoming inequality across the world, between countries and within countries. So it must be on the G20 agenda. That's absolutely clear. Second, and also that relates to clearly to gender equality, and just a little plug, we're not only about goats, although feel free to buy goats because that funds the other work that we do.
You're about primary schools too.
Oxfam next month will release a report on, with the Heinrich Böll Foundation, on gender equality across the G20 and women's rights across the G20, and we would encourage all of you to engage with us on lobby around the main messages of that report. And then second and final point, I fully agree with what Cassandra had to say. Our role is both to challenge power, to demonstrate that a different world is absolutely possible. And in doing that, to come back, you made the remark about Joe Hockey. You know, I'm not an Australian, I don't live here. And I certainly don't want to get drawn into issues of right and left. And I think, certainly for me, I try not to think in that way. I try to think in issues of right and wrong. And I think that's the choice for ourselves that we all have to make.
Helen?
So I want to come back to this issue of language. And I think very often when we end up in these discussions, somebody starts talking about economics and then very quickly somebody starts talking about being rational. Nobody's yet gone quite there, but I think we're very near to that. And the political philosopher Iris Marion Young had it absolutely right when she said that, you know, when we deliberate, and essentially what we are doing is deliberating in these forums, whichever they are, the privileging of what we consider to be rational speech is not only wrong, but it's also entirely erroneous, because those people with power don't just use rational speech. They use emotion and storytelling and narrative and all of those other things. So I think there is something really important about both not dismissing the kind of love and support and the emotional as somehow being, you know, things that happen in the social and don't happen in the economic. Of course they do. It's just about how sophisticated you are at using them. And the second thing is, I think, linked to that very often, and we've had a bit of it, I think, in this discussion, is this notion of there being a set of defined interests, ours and theirs. Now, you can see interests in that way, that we come to questions with our interests as given and fixed, but you can also see interests as things that are fluid and capable of being transformed. And that maybe what we ought to be doing is thinking about not just how we can win others over, but also how we can transform the whole game in the end, so that we're not simply engaged in a narrative of either war or peace, but we're actually trying to find something else entirely.
Thank you. And finally?
Just to use Cassandra's word about war, I think we have so many ammunitions. We just need to sharpen our ammunitions to be strategic, and with the word of love, humanity, and peace, I think we can win the war. And in my own case, for Timor, I want to close by saying that for 24 years, we have used the word of love, peace, and we win the war. Thank you.
Thanks, Anarita. I hope you'll keep the applause going, and just thank the panel. I think that's been a really interesting discussion and very enjoyable. Thank you.